This move initiates the English opening, a flexible flank opening that aims to control central squares from the side and often leads to varied pawn structures and strategic battles rather than immediate sharp tactical clashes. This move signals a transition towards classical defenses like the French defense or Queen's Gambit. Declined. Preparing to challenge White's central pawn. This move establishes central pawn control and opens lines for queen and bishop development, transposing into the queen's pawn game and setting the stage for common English opening continuations or a Queen's Gambit declined structure. This move, developing a knight towards the center and preparing to castle, is the most common and principled response, transposing into a queen's pawn game or potentially a king's Indian defense structure if White continues with nc3 and Black plays d5. This move develops a knight to its natural square, preparing to castle and supporting the central pawn advance while controlling key squares like d4 and e5, fitting into several English and Queen's pawn game transpositions. This move initiates a Queen's Indian defense setup, aiming to control the central light squares and prepare for a fianchetto of the bishop to b7. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop, reinforcing the long diagonal and aiming to control key central squares from a safe distance. This move develops the bishop to a long, active diagonal, preparing to control the center and potentially pressure White's queenside. This move develops the bishop to a powerful long diagonal, preparing to castle and supporting White's central pawn presence while eyeing Black's queenside. Developing the bishop to e7 completes Black's kingside development and prepares for kingside castling, a standard setup in many Queen's pawn openings like the Queen's Indian or Bogo Indian defense. This move completes the essential king safety maneuver, consolidating the pawn chain and preparing for central pawn breaks or piece development. Castling on the kingside consolidates the king's position and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental step in most pawn structures arising from the English opening and Queen's pawn game complex. This move develops the knight to its most natural square, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing for further central control and potential kingside expansion. This move challenges White's central control and aims to reroute the knight to more active squares, potentially preparing to exchange pieces or support a kingside advance. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting the knight on c3, potentially eyeing the d5 square, and preparing to support a kingside pawn advance. This move breaks the symmetry and opens the d-file, creating imbalances for the queenside pawn structure and potentially freeing Black's pieces. This recapture on c3 opens the queen's diagonal and centralizes it, preparing to support a kingside attack while eyeing the d5 square. Black challenges White's central pawn control, aiming to create an imbalanced pawn structure and open lines for active piece play. This move prepares to contest the central d-file and potentially support a pawn advance with d5, while also clearing the way for further piece development. This move strengthens the pawn center, preparing to contest White's central control and potentially opening lines for Black's pieces. This move reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares to develop the queenside bishop, aiming to establish a solid pawn structure and control central squares. This move connects the rooks and prepares to contest the d-file while simultaneously supporting the pawn on circa 5, a common strategic goal in this type of English opening structure. This move develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, eyeing the center and preparing to contest the d-file with the rook. The bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, potentially pressuring White's queenside pawn structure and preparing for future central play. This move repositions the queen to a more flexible square, preparing to contest the open c-file and support potential central pawn breaks while potentially avoiding pressure on the d1 rook. This knight transfer prepares to challenge white's control of the d-file and opens a diagonal for the light-squared bishop to potentially influence the kingside. This move bravely stakes a central claim, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially create an isolated d-pawn for black if the central tension is resolved unfavorably. This move prepares to contest the central d-file and potentially develop the rook further to the central mass, supporting the knight on d7 and preparing for future central pawn breaks. The move 15. K2 reroutes the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting the advance of the e-pawn or preparing to contest the d-file. The knight's move to d7 has effectively cleared the way for this rook to occupy the c-file, a crucial central file that will likely become contested as the game progresses. This move prepares to double rooks on the d-file, aiming to increase pressure on black's central pawn structure and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from the e4-e5 pawn push. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn control and potentially activate the queen on the c6-2 diagonal after the d6 pawn advances. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, supporting the pawn advance and preparing to contest the central open files that are likely to arise. The move 17. Re8 is a sensible defensive maneuver, preparing to contest the crucial e-file and potentially reinforce the e6 pawn if white decides to push their e-pawn further. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting the e4 pawn or preparing a regrouping to the kingside, while also clearing the d1 square for the rook. This move repositions the rook to the semi-open d-file, supporting the central pawn and potentially preparing for future operations along this important line or to defend against black's own d-file intentions. This move initiates a kingside pawn storm, aiming to create attacking chances by opening lines against black's castled position, while also preparing to reinforce the center if black attempts counterplay. This move prepares to expand on the queenside, aiming to create play against white's potentially passive pawn structure and gain space. This move initiates a kingside pawn storm, aiming to create weaknesses around black's king and exploit the slightly less defended g7 bishop. This move prepares to challenge white's kingside pawn advance and gain space for black's pieces, potentially opening lines for the bishop on b7. This pawn advance contests the g-file and challenges black's piece structure, aiming to create weaknesses in the kingside pawn formation or gain space. The bishop retreats to g7, preserving its important defensive role along the long diagonal while also preparing to potentially redeploy to a more active square if white commits their pawns further on the kingside. This central pawn push aims to disrupt black's coordination and create dynamic tension, potentially opening lines for white's pieces while challenging black's pawn chain. This pawn break on d5, while seemingly opening lines, concedes central space and allows white's pieces to gain more active posts, particularly the queen on e2 and the rook on d2. This pawn capture opens the e-file, creating immediate tension and potentially activating the queen and rook for action along this crucial central corridor. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially targeting white's queenside pawns or supporting a central pawn push. This exchange clears the d5 square for white's pieces and prepares to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, potentially leading to a queenside initiative. This move recaptures the bishop, centralizing the king and preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority while opening a diagonal for the queen. This rook lift maneuver aims to reposition the rook to a more active file, potentially the g file after further pawn advances, or to support an e-pawn push in the center. This move prepares to reposition the king to a safer square, potentially on e7 or d7, away from the exposed d file and any potential discovered attacks along the semi-open c file. This move activates the queen to the a1 h8 diagonal, potentially preparing to support a pawn push on the kingside or to target black's queenside. Structure. The king retreats to a safer square, preparing to redeploy to a more active position on the kingside after white's g4 gram5 advance creates a dynamic pawn tension. The move qb2 aims to centralize the queen, connecting the rooks on the d-file and potentially preparing to contest the d-file or offer support for pawn advances on the queenside. The knight repositions to f8 to potentially support a kingside advance or to prepare for a maneuver to e6, aiming to challenge white's central pawn control and pressure the d5 pawn. This move initiates a direct attack on the weakened black king, exploiting the open g file and the pressure on f7. This move centralizes the knight, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square like e5 or potentially support a future pawn push, while relieving the defense of the f6 square. This move captures a seemingly free pawn, but it opens lines for black's rooks and bishop, and potentially weakens white's kingside if black can create counterplay. This move repositions the knight to a more central outpost, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially disrupt white's plans for queenside expansion. This capture sacrifices material to forcibly open lines against black's king, aiming to exploit the vulnerable g-file and potentially create tactical opportunities in the center.